Now moving on to video part 3 of the JFK assassination. This one is kind of my favorite. I get a little excited talking about it because it's about a man named Jack Ruby who, as I mentioned earlier, shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald. And this man is very interesting. He has a very interesting few days, and I can't quite pin down his mindset. But I find this really fascinating, so let's dig in. Jack Ruby is a man who lives in Dallas, Texas, and he's the kind of guy that walks around in a suit. He owns 2 clubs, the Carousel Club, which is a strip joint, and the Vegas Club, which is a, quote, rock and roll establishment. Now, mind you, pretty much everything I'm going to tell you here today about him comes from collections of information that are put together in the Warren Commission report. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of their findings weren't super accurate, but this is a reconstruction of his day based on FBI interrogations as well as testimonies under oath, and it's going to be the best source of information that we have available to us to go through. The investigative team decided to look into his 3 or 4 days around the assassination, and that includes the day prior, the day of, the day after, and some of the day after that. And it's quite fascinating. So his day prior to the assassination, so it's Thursday, November 21st, 1963. So he visited with a young lady who was looking for work. I'm assuming for the strip club, but I can't be sure. It could be either one. And he paid his rent for the Carousel Club, and then he went to confer, I'm assuming with an attorney, about a peace bond that he had to pay as a result of having gotten into a physical altercation with one of his dancers previously. Then he speaks with his attorney about his problems with federal tax authorities, and then he speaks with the assistant district attorney about some bad checks that a friend of his had written, a friend of Ruby's. And all of that's very fascinating to me. So I'm getting certain vibes from this information. And that's quite a day. The assistant district attorney that he met with is William F. Alexander. And then he submitted copies of an advertisement that he wanted to place for his nightclubs to the Dallas Morning News. So at this point, we know that he's the kind of guy that gets into fights with his dancers. He owns a strip bar and a dance club, I think is what the Vegas Club is, and doesn't want to pay his federal taxes, apparently. So at this point, he shows up at 3 p.m. to the Carousel Club, which is pretty much his usual routine, and he confers with Larry Crawford, which is spelled Crafard, not like Crawford with a W, but Crawford. And and Larry Crawford is his live-in handyman employee that lives at the Carousel Club. So he remained at the Carousel Club long enough to chat with a friend and receive messages from Larry Crawford. So around 7:30 p.m., he drives Larry Crawford to the Vegas Club, which he was overseeing while Ruby's sister, Eva Grant, who normally managed it, was on convalescent leave following a recent illness. Then he returned to the Carousel Club, where he spoke with a man named Lawrence Myers, a Chicago businessman, for about an hour. Then between 9:45 and 10:45 p.m., he had dinner with his friend Ralph Paul, a close friend and financial backer. And while having dinner, he also spoke a little bit with a Dallas Morning News employee, Don Campbell, who suggested that they go to this other club, the Castaway Club, but Ruby declined. Ruby returned to the Carousel Club, where he acted as the master of ceremonies and peacefully ejected an unruly patron. So translation, I believe, would be he went back to announce his dancers as they went on stage and then got rid of somebody that probably got too handsy. So around midnight, he met back up with Lawrence Myers in the Bon Vivant room of a place called the Cabana Club, where they also met up with Lawrence's brother and sister-in-law. So he meets up with these people at this other club, stays very briefly, then leaves again, goes back to the Carousel Club to close up and go through the receipts. Then he goes to the Vegas Club to help Crawford close up. And then after that, he was seen as late as 2:30 a.m. Eating at a local restaurant near the Dallas Club. So that's the last we have on him for the day prior. Then the day of, November 22nd, 1963. So at some point in the morning on Friday, the 22nd, he called his sister to speak to her about an ad he had seen in the paper, which would later become known as the Wiseman advertisement. Then around 11 or 11:30, he arrived at the Dallas Times-Herald and spoke with a couple of employees that he had previously recommended some diet pills to about those diet pills. He then made his way to the office of one Tony Zoppi, an advertising columnist, and that's where he allegedly obtained a brochure for his new Master of Ceremonies that he wanted to use, I think, as a sample for the advertisement that he wanted to place. After that, he made his way to the advertising office, where he spoke with an employee there named Don Campbell. And according to Campbell, they spoke from about 12 to 12:25. According to Campbell, Ruby behaved as he normally did. He expressed unhappiness over the financial situations at his clubs and professed his physical ability to handle the fights that broke out at the clubs. Then Campbell left around 12:25. So then another employee would later confirm that Ruby was still sitting in the same place that Campbell had left him. About 10 minutes after the president was shot, but before news had reached the second floor, which is where the advertising department was, where they were located. So about 12:40 now. Advertising department employee John Newnham claimed to have observed Ruby sitting at the same spot Campbell had left him, and he had finished composing his advertisement and was just sitting there reading a newspaper. Ruby then voiced criticism to Newnham over this advertisement that he saw in the paper, which would later be known as the Wiseman advertisement. He claimed that it was an effort to discredit the Jews. And I'll explain a little bit later exactly what that advertisement had in it. It's a black bordered advertisement that he felt was like anti-Semitic. Then at about 12:45 p.m., an employee ran in and announced the news that shots had been fired at the president. And Newnham would later state that Ruby appeared shocked and ashen in color and not really inclined to speak very much. Then chaos ensued as all these phone calls were coming in, people trying to cancel their advertisements for the weekend. And Newnham would say that Ruby had this theory that these cancellations had something to do with the Wiseman advertisement. And then they made their way to a nearby room where people were watching news on the TV. And this is where Ruby really didn't seem to want to talk to anyone. He was quiet. He seemed very upset, very sad. Oops, I said that was Newnham. It was actually another employee who claimed he was ashen, just very pale, and didn't really seem interested in conversing. So after a few minutes, Jack Ruby then placed a call to Andrew Armstrong, at the Carousel Club, his bartender. He told Armstrong, if anything happens, we're going to have to close the club, and then told him that he would see him in about 30 minutes. He then placed another call, this one to his sister, Eva. During the call, he also mentioned the advertisement, and then obviously about the assassination, and at one point put the phone to Newnham's ear, who claimed that he heard her exclaim, "My God, what do they want?" Then allegedly, Ruby tried to calm her down. And Newnham would testify that after placing that call, Ruby would say to him, John Newnham, "I will have to leave Dallas. But later, when questioned and testifying, he claimed that he didn't know why he said that. He kind of seemed to like suggest that he was in a state of shock. His specific quote, I think, he didn't know what else transpired, but people were just heartbroken and he couldn't stop crying after he got into his car. Noonan estimated that Ruby left the Dallas Morning News around 1:30 p.m., but other testimony suggested earlier. So here, his timeline gets a little muddled. One person thought that they recognized him. I think it was actually somebody that worked for the police that thought that they saw him at the hospital. And that investigative committee here didn't seem to think so. They didn't think it was likely because traffic would have likely been congested, so they don't think he would have had time. But the person thought to have seen him around 1:30, and they did establish that it would only be like right around 1:30 that he would have been there for a very short period. This person claimed that he had said, "Should I close my clubs, do you think, for 3 days?" And this really couldn't be confirmed. It's generally thought by the commission and this report that he, in fact, did not go to the hospital, but proceeded to the Carousel Club, where he arrived no later than 1:45 and supposedly even a few minutes sooner. And it gets kind of interesting here. So he starts placing all these phone calls over a period of probably about an hour, hour and a half. I wonder about if he had been at the hospital, what would even be his reasoning? Maybe to find out if the president had died or not, since at that point I think the news was just that shots were fired. Although I did speak with my grandma recently about the assassination, because I know that she was around at the time, alive at the time, and she actually told me that she had seen it because the motorcade was being recorded live. And so if that's the case, depending on how closely people were watching their televisions, they may have seen, an exit wound from the head, and people might have assumed he was dead. But that's just my kind of guess at why Jack Ruby may have gone to the hospital if he did. So he went to the Carousel Club, he started placing a bunch of phone calls, and I also have some interesting ideas about why he placed all these rapid phone calls. As soon as he arrived at the Carousel Club around 1:45 p.m., he instructed the bartender Armstrong to call around and inform the other employees that the club would be closed for the night. So during his time there, he went back and forth between speaking with his friend Ralph. Well, he called his friend Ralph Paul to tell him that he was closing the clubs and urged him to do the same with his drive-in restaurant. He also alternated between watching TV, speaking with Armstrong and Crawford about the assassination, and making these phone calls. After the first one, he called his sister Eileen Kaminsky in Chicago, Alice Nichols, a former girlfriend who he hadn't seen in some time, but had dated for 11 years, I guess. And then Alex Gruber, a boyhood friend from Chicago who was living in LA, and talked about a dog he had promised to send him, a car wash business he had considered starting, and the assassination. Supposedly lost his composure and had to hang up. Then, 2 minutes later, called Ralph Paul again. So he's making all these phone calls in rapid succession, and it almost makes me wonder, if he was involved in some conspiracy here. The way he reacted to the news, I wasn't around at the time. I know my grandmother did tell me that people were pretty shocked and upset because he was a well-liked president pretty much all around. But when I was initially reading through this report and how people described his reaction being so devastated and shocked and ashen, I kind of wondered if he was involved in conspiracy where, hey, if this happens, you need to do this, that, and the other. And then he didn't think it was actually going to happen, so then he was shocked when it did happen, or was it all an act, or was it genuine? Was he genuinely just deeply upset that this had happened? I'm not sure, and I'm not sure we'll ever know, but it is interesting to talk about his day-to-day and some of the connections with different people and just everything about him. And I kind of have to wonder, too, could it be that he placed so many phone calls because maybe one of them was for a secret communique, to pass along some message or what have you, but make it harder for investigators later to figure out whom to, or what the message might have been. I mean, that's just conjecture on my part. I have no idea. It's just kind of some of the things I was wondering as I was reading through everything. So about 3:15, he left and drove over to his sister Eva's house, but he only stayed briefly, and then he left again in order to go get food for them for the weekend. But then he ended up going to the Carousel Club, where he had placed another phone call to her, and she reminded him to get food for the weekend. So then he left and he went to a local delicatessen, the Ritz Delicatessen, 2 blocks down from the club, and bought a great quantity of cold cuts. Oh, and the reason that he had returned to the Carousel Club after his sister Eva's was to instruct Crawford to make a sign saying that they were going to be closed, but not to put it up until later in the evening so as not to alert his competitors. They think he returned to his sister's house around 5:30 p.m., where he continued his rapid rate of phone calls. He stayed there for about 2 hours, and he, among making all these phone calls, ate sparingly and then became ill, and then decided to try to get some rest. Which, at that point, I was kind of wondering, is he drinking? Is he on drugs? His behavior just seems a little bit strange to me. I don't fully understand it, but then again, I wasn't there and I can't really speak to the level of shock. So he called Don Safran at the Dallas Times-Herald, a columnist, and informed him that they would be closed. But then immediately after hanging up, he conferred with his sister, and she suggested that they close for 3 days. And so he called Don back, and he let him know that he was going to be closed for 3 days. And after that, he called the Dallas Morning News to cancel his ad there, but they wouldn't let him. I'm assuming because probably a lot of people were trying to cancel their ads and they didn't want to lose all that money. What they did let him do is change the ad to say that he would be closed for 3 days. Then he placed some more calls, including 2 to find out if services were going to be held at the Temple Sharif Israel, but he wanted to know when services would be held. So now his timeline gets a little muddied again, and some people thought that they might have seen him on the 3rd floor of the Police and Courts building, but that's unconfirmed and Ruby denies it. It is confirmed, however, that he arrived back at his apartment around 9 p.m. So we have about 2 hours that are unaccounted for. Once there, he started making phone calls again. He called Ralph Paul to try to convince him to go to the synagogue services, but was unable to convince him. Then he called his oldest brother, Hyman Rubenstein, which I wonder if Ruby is for short then, for Rubenstein. He also called 2 of his sisters, Marion Carroll and Ann Volpert. And when talking to his brother, he allegedly was so disturbed by the whole thing that he considered selling his businesses and moving back to Chicago. Then he drove to Temple Sharif Israel, arriving at the end of a 2-hour-long service that began at 8 p.m. And he briefly spoke to the Rabbi Hillel Silverman, who was supposedly surprised that Jack Ruby appeared very down, but didn't mention the assassination at all. He only spoke about his sister's recent illness. And he stayed for the after-service refreshments, and then he went driving around to see if competing clubs were also going to be closed, and then headed back into town. And on his way back into town, the radio mentioned that the police would be working overtime. So at this point, he just kind of takes it upon himself and decides that he's going to buy food for them. And so he goes to a local delicatessen and he buys 8 kosher sandwiches and 10 soft drinks. And then he started placing some phone calls and speaking with some local boys, teasing them about being too young to go to his club, and then as a tip gives the counterman a card for free entry to his clubs. So because cell phones aren't a thing in 1963, I'm fairly certain. So he's using their phone to make phone calls and chit-chatting with these boys, saying some whatever stuff, and teasing them about being too young to go to his club. But then I'm guessing the counterman is old enough, because as a tip, instead of money, he gives him free entrance to his businesses. Okay. This guy, he never stops advertising for his businesses. So this was around 10:30 that he stopped at this delicatessen near the Vegas Club. And then he calls the local police department to let them know that he bought this food for them, only to be told that the officers had already eaten. So now he decides that he wants to give it to the local news radio station KLIF. So then he makes his way to the Dallas Police Department, supposedly around 11:30 p.m., where he kind of disguises himself like as a reporter. And so witnesses, including officers there, would say that, yeah, they saw him like walking out of the elevator between two reporters that had these big red press passes. And he didn't have one, but he was kind of hunched over, scribbling in a notebook, walking between them very briefly. He tells people that he's a translator for the Israeli press. So it was the chief's office that they were walking towards. And it would later be confirmed via camera tapes, that he was present on the third floor when Chief Jesse E. Curry and District Attorney Henry M. Wade announced that Oswald would be shown to the newsmen in the basement for a press conference at midnight. He claimed that he was originally only there to try to get a hold of a KLIF employee, but got swept up in the excitement, quote, carried away with the excitement of history. And he attended the midnight news conference where they brought Oswald out and he got to see him. And Wade had misspoken apparently while speaking about Oswald and talking about his connection to the Free Cuba Committee. Yeah, Free Cuba Committee. But a few reporters spoke up to correct him, and Ruby chimed in as well, which how the heck would he know? So is he just trying to be involved and they're all saying it so he's jumping on board, or does he somehow know about this Oswald guy? I mean, there's no internet yet, so... And then he followed the district attorney out and walked up to him, according to Wade, and then said, "Hi, Henry. Don't you know me? It's me, Jack Ruby. I own the Vegas Club." And he also introduced himself to Justice of the Peace David L. Johnston and shook his hand and gave him a business card to the Carousel Club. And then upon learning his official position, shook his hand again. Then he gave a card to Icarus Pappas, a reporter for New York radio station WNEW. Then from a rep of a radio station K-Box in Dallas, he obtained the hotline number for KLIF. So then I'm kind of picturing like a wall of phones, or maybe they had some phones set up on the desks in preparation, I'm not sure, but there's some phones kind of in the same area. And he gets on one and he calls KLIF to ask them if he can come and distribute the sandwiches. And then this Pappas guy is on the phone and holding the line open and trying to get Wade's attention. And Jack Ruby, he sees this, and so he goes and he kind of grabs Wade and ushers him to Pappas in order to secure him an interview. And then called a KLIF back, offering to secure an interview with Wade for them as well. And then he got him on the phone for that, and then he encountered Russ Knight, a reporter from KLIF who had left KLIF shortly before, and he directed him to Wade as well, where that man was able to secure an interview with District Attorney Wade. Then he left and he went to KLIF at about 1:45 a.m. and stayed for about 45 minutes. He distributed the food and the soft drinks, and settled in the newsroom for the 2 a.m. newscast, where he was credited with suggesting that Russ Knight asked the DA if Oswald was sane. He then gave an employee there a card for the Carousel Club, and he spoke with Patrick McCurdy and mentioned that he would rather lose $1,200 or $1,500 than stay open for those 3 days out of respect for the president. And McCurdy would also say that he looked pale and kept looking at the floor. He was then reported to have not to appeared sad, but excited to have been involved with the investigation earlier and the mounting evidence against Oswald. Ruby walked out with Russ Knight, and they chatted for a bit, and Ruby had a radio script that he handed Knight entitled Heroism from a conservative radio program called Lifeline, which had come into his hands a few weeks prior at the Texas Products Show when Hunt Foods were including such scripts with samples of their products. The script extolled the virtues of those who embark on risky business ventures and stand firmly for causes that they believe to be correct. He asked Knight's views on the script and suggested that there was a group of radicals in Dallas which hated JFK and that the owner of the station should editorialize against this group. So, is he seeking confirmation that he should be active in fighting for his cause? Doing something about this? Or, I don't know. So around 2:30 a.m., he gets in his car and heads to the Dallas Times-Herald. But on the way there, he spies Kay Helen Coleman, one of his dancers, and Harry Olson of the Dallas PD. And they hailed him over, and so he came over and he spoke with them for a while. During this conversation, so he initially didn't actually admit this to the FBI agents that were interviewing him, but it did come up later, and he said that the reason he didn't initially bring it up was because the relationship between the two of them was supposed to be kept secret. But 6 weeks after this, he left the police department and they ended up getting married. So he comes over to them, and this is on the corner of Jackson and Field Street. And the couple were allegedly crying and extremely upset over the assassination. So Ruby spoke with them for quite a while, during which he claims that Mr. Olson had stated they should cut him inch by inch into ribbons, and that Mrs. Coleman had stated in England he would have been drugged through the street and hanged. But of course later, both of them would say, well, I don't recall saying that, but I do recall that Ruby had referred to Oswald as a little weasel of a man, and that he was, very upset about the assassination and expressed concern for Mrs. Kennedy and her children. After this, he arrives at the Dallas Times-Herald a little after 4 a.m., where he starts speaking with Roy Pryor, who had just finished his shift there in the composing room. So during this 15-minute chat, Ruby mentions that he had seen Oswald earlier during that press conference, and that he corrected District Attorney Wade in connection with the Fair Play for Cuba committee, and how he'd set up the telephone interviews with Wade. Pryor would also later testify that Ruby explicitly told him that he believed he was in good favor with the district attorney. So this report is definitely painting a picture of a self-important, stroke my ego kind of guy. Definitely getting some Mafia-esque kind of vibes from his day-to-day as well. So he also said that Ruby had referred to Oswald as a little weasel of a man and expressed concern for Mrs. Kennedy and her children. And then he left, and Ruby remained chatting with some other people, including Arthur Watherwax and foreman Clyde Gadash. And he wanted Watherwax's opinion on his decision to close the clubs. and he indicated that he planned to try to convince other club owners to do the same. He would later describe Ruby as simultaneously shaken up about the assassination, as well as excited about his involvement in attending the midnight press conference. So then Ruby showed off a twist board, which is it's a piece of exercise equipment that consists of two boards with something in the middle so that the top board can swivel. So a person would stand on it and force themselves to swivel around. I'm assuming it would work the core. He had previously promised it to Gadash, and in the weeks prior had been pushing it to sell it. Considerable merriment developed when one of the female employees demonstrated, and then Ruby put on a demonstration. He would later testify, quote, "Not that I wanted to get in with the hilarity of frolicking, but he, Gadesh, asked me to show him, and the other men gathered around." But Gadash would agree that Ruby's general mood was of sorrow. So around 4:30 a.m., he leaves for home. Actually, the way the report is written, it's unclear whether he arrived home or left there, but I believe he left there at about 4:30. And on the way home, he passed this signboard, which had an ad on it imploring people to impeach the Chief Justice, Earl Warren. That's the same Earl Warren of the Warren Commission. And it's shortly after 4:30 a.m. He gets home and he wakes up his roommate to talk to him about the Wiseman advertisement and the this advertisement on this signboard that said, impeach Chief Justice Earl Warren. And then he calls the Carousel Club to Larry Crawford and tells him, get the Polaroid camera that we keep in the club and grab that and then head out to the Nichols garage adjacent to the Carousel Club and wait for us there. We're going to come get you. And so he and his roommate, George Senator, they go and they pick up Larry Crawford with this Polaroid camera, and they drive to this signboard, which is located near Hull Avenue and Central Expressway in Dallas. And when they got there, he instructed Crawford to take 3 photographs of it. And he noted a name and a P.O. box number that were also on the signboard, and he wrote those down on the back of an envelope. And Crawford would later claim that he seemed convinced that there was a connection between these two signs, and that he would say, quote, "This is the work of the John Birch Society or the Communist Party or a combination thereof," which is interesting to me because so I researched the John Birch Society, thinking it was like a defunct political advocacy group. And it's actually something that's still around today. And it seems like they're just very anti-communist and pro-American and concerned about the education system, the Department of Education, and but mainly just anti-communism and trying to point out or get rid of communist people in politics here. And it seems like that was kind of always their thing. So for him to say that this anti-Semitic advertisement, which is the Wiseman advertisement, which I'm about to explain, and this impeach Earl Warren sign are connected and put on by this group, and or an anti-communist group and a communist group, is just very interesting to me. I don't know if maybe he didn't know what they were, or if there's just something I'm not understanding there. So the John Birch Society, I even pulled up their website. So yeah, according to jbs.org, the John Birch Society website, there's a few quotes here. "We, as Americans, cherish our God-given liberties. We stand for a free and independent nation that fully abides by the Constitution and the Founding Fathers' values. The John Birch Society provides a national program designed to counter the deep state / big government agenda and to restore our rights. Standing at the forefront of battle to restore constitutional freedoms, we can secure a future with less government and more responsibility. And they also have a video labeled Communism Corrupts Morals. So that's this John Birch Society that he refers to. I think we all pretty much know what the Communist Party is, so no need to explain that. But then now talking about the Wiseman advertisement. So the Wiseman advertisement is... it came out in the paper, I believe, the day the president's motorcade was supposed to be in Dallas, and it had a thick black border, which, Ruby noted was similar to a death note, so he thought maybe it was like a hint that the assassination was going to happen, and thought that maybe whoever had put out this advertisement had maybe been involved somehow. Also, it's pretty derogative towards the president, towards President Kennedy at the time. So it said, "Dear Mr. Kennedy," which in itself, I think that's already a little insulting, because I think much like police or military or like a doctor, to say Mr. to a doctor, you'll get corrected really fast. And I usually don't hear someone call the president Mr. and then their name. It's usually Mr. President or President such and forth. And so it says in big headlines, "Dear Mr. Kennedy," and then underneath it has a bunch of questions. Mr. Kennedy, why is it that this? And why is it that that? I do believe the image is copyrighted, so I will not be overlaying it in this video, but I will try to describe it as best as I can. So according to wisconsinhistory.org, and this does kind of match what I could see in pictures, and you can Google it yourself if you're curious to see it. But it's, let's see, the lower half had a dozen questions, starting with the word "why," preceded by the statement, "Mr. Kennedy." So, we free-thinking and America-thinking citizens of Dallas still have, through a constitution largely ignored by you, the right to address all grievances, to question you, to disagree with you, and to criticize you. In asserting this constitutional right, we wish to ask you publicly the following questions. Indeed, questions of paramount importance and interest to all free peoples everywhere, which we trust you will answer in public without sophistry. And so, also according to this site, which seems to be fairly accurate, they put forth that the cost of the ad was $1,465, and there actually was a connection to the John Birch Society, but it's not like that society put it out there necessarily. All that's confirmed here is that the money was provided by a Joseph P. Grinnan, who was a member of the John Birch Society. But Wiseman himself was not associated with with them. He was associated, I forget where I found his information, but he was associated with the fact-finding committee, the American Fact-Finding Committee, and, supposedly was not involved at all with the John Birch Society. Oh, it isn't here. Chairman of the American Fact-Finding Committee. The committee described themselves as an unaffiliated and nonpartisan group of citizens who wish truth, but they were, in fact, affiliated with the John Birch Society because Joseph was in it, I guess. I'm not going to get too much into that, but that's what that advertisement is. It was not the most welcoming, I guess you could say, to President Kennedy. And so Jack Ruby, he seems to think that that this advertisement is somehow anti-Semitic, which maybe I'll come back to that later and try to research how it could be, because I haven't figured that out yet. And he seems to think that it's put on by this John Birch Society and or the Communist Party. And again, I'm a little confused by that because they seem to be two opposing groups. So it's sometime between probably 4:30 and 5 o'clock, probably closer to 5, and they're, looking at he wakes up his roommate, and I'm not sure if he woke up Mr. Crawford or if, Crawford had already been awake, because they usually stayed up pretty late managing the clubs. But they're standing there at this early hour. Then they leave and drive to the post office, where he asks a postal employee, what's the name of the person that rents this P.O. box that's mentioned on this advertisement? And the employee is like, I can't give you that. But he apparently is able to inspect the box. I don't know if he like peeked through the where you insert mail from or what, but he was upset to find that it was stuffed with mail, which I'm assuming is because this group is getting correspondence, and maybe he thinks that they're a bad group. And I'm also a little bit confused by the fact that it's now Saturday morning and there's a post office that is open and has employees there. I feel like that's maybe not really a normal thing, but maybe in Texas it is, or maybe back in the 60s it was. So after, not getting the information that he wanted there, the three of them leave and they drive to a coffee shop where they sit and chat for about 30 minutes, where Jack Ruby continues to talk about these two advertisements and possible connection between them. At which point I'm kind of wondering, are these two men going along with him like, oh yeah, I think you're right? Or are they just like, I don't know, maybe he knows something I don't? Or are they like, well, he's like the one anyway. He's the boss, so I gotta sit here and endure this because I'm paid to deal with this kind of crazy. Or are they sitting there going like, this guy's fucking crazy, he dragged me out of bed for this? I have no idea. I have no clue what the mental state is of any of these three men. But they chat for about 30 minutes at this coffee shop. And so then they leave. They drop off Crawford at the Carousel Club on their way back to their apartment, where Ruby supposedly retires at 6 a.m. But earlier he had told Crawford that he was going to stay up, and he forgot that he told him that. And apparently he had also asked Larry Crawford to feed his dogs, which I'm a little confused by. Why did he have dogs at the Carousel Club? Is that where he had them, or did he have them in a kennel somewhere? Why did he have dogs that didn't live with him? And why would the person that is feeding these dogs not know, like, did he not know where the food was, or I don't know. More questions than answers regarding that. But he had asked him to feed his dogs, and he had a question about the food, and so he called at about 8 or 8:30 a.m., which woke Ruby up. And Ruby, having forgotten that he told him he was going to stay up, he berated him for waking him up. And I think it's really funny that the report includes all this information, but so he hangs up with him and then he stays awake, right? Well, Crawford, back at the Carousel Club, after a few hours, he decides, you know what, done. And he gathers up his few belongings and he takes $5 from the cash register, which he had been owed. And he left a receipt and a thank you note and hitchhiked to Michigan. So I guess he's willing to do all this crazy stuff, but the final straw where he's decided I quit was Ruby, yelling at him for waking him up. And then so later Armstrong, who also worked there, would find that note and let Ruby know. So Ruby, he doesn't go back to bed. He stays awake and he watches a eulogy on the television by... Oh, and I really hope those dogs got fed. Poor dogs. I'm really curious about the dogs. I really want to know, were they at a strip club and did they get fed? That's the one thing I really want to know about this whole this whole assassination is, did the dogs get fed? So anyway, he watches this eulogy delivered by a rabbi on TV for President Kennedy, which he apparently found very moving. And then he leaves between noon and 1:30, chats with a police officer at the Dealey Plaza, introduces himself to a reporter for radio station KRLD, and that reporter told him he had heard about Ruby getting the KLIF employee the interview with Wade. And at that point, Wade then points out to him that the Captain J. Will Fritz and Chief Curry were nearby. So then that reporter was able to get an interview and photographs of the officers. So then after that, he was witnessed at... So pardon the magical outfit change, but he was then witnessed at the parking garage adjacent to the Carousel Club, the Nichols parking garage, by Garnet C. Hallmark, who was the general manager of the garage, and Tom Brown, an attendant there. Brown heard Ruby mentioned Chief Curry's name on the phone, and Hallmark testified that Ruby told him he was acting like a reporter, and that on the phone he had addressed the other person on the line as Ken. He had discussed the transfers of Oswald and said, "You know I'll be there." He had allegedly been talking to Ken Dow, a KLIF announcer, whom he had told he was going to track down Henry Wade, in trying to figure out when Oswald was going to be transferred. So from here, the recreation of what his day looked like gets a little muddled, but apparently he was shuttling back and forth between the police and courts building and the plaza. So according to the Warren report, and the recreation by witness testimony, etc., around 3 p.m., Ruby, a non-drinker, went to Saul's Turf Bar on Commerce Street, where he remained for about 45 minutes. He stated that it was to meet with his accountant, who customarily would prepare the bar's bankroll on Saturday afternoon. But the accountant said he saw him for maybe 5 minutes, and they didn't discuss any business. Ruby was first noticed at the bar by a jeweler named Frank Bellocchio, who then began to berate the people of Dallas for the assassination. Ruby disagreed, and when Bellocchio said he was thinking of closing up shop and leaving Dallas, Ruby said he tried to soothe him and tell him that there were still good people in Dallas, and as his response, Bellocchio pointed to a copy of the Wiseman advertisement, to which Ruby said he thought it was the work of a group trying to create anti-Semitic feelings in Dallas. Then he showed him one of his Polaroid pictures of the Impeach Earl Warren sign, Chief Justice Earl Warren, and he excitedly began to rail against it as if he agreed with Bellocchio's statement. He testified that Ruby seemed to be taking two sides and wasn't making any sense. Around 4 p.m., Ruby called his friend and attorney, Stanley Kaufman, who had previously represented him in civil matters. So, okay. We know that he has an attorney that's also his friend that's previously represented him because he's had troubles with the law. He has federal tax problems, and I don't know. I'm just getting some vibes, like some Mafia-esque type of stuff thus far. So Kaufman testified that Ruby had suspected that the black border around the Wiseman advertisement indicated that it's like that it was a tip-off to the impending assassination, and that he had attempted to locate Wiseman by going to the post office in an attempt to help law enforcement. So then his day gets a little muddled again, and he starts placing all these phone calls again, including one to a guy named Breck Wall, to determine whether the American Guild of Variety Artists, AGVA, which is the union for strippers in Dallas. He met regarding a dispute he was having with the union. So he was whining about how his competitors were violating a ban on striptease contests and performances by amateurs. And he was upset that they didn't have the decency to close after such a terrible event. After midnight, he went to the Pago Club, which is about a 10-minute drive from the Carousel Club, where he asked why they were open, but supposedly did not criticize them for it. And then the manager came over and talked to him, Robert Norton, and told him, they just couldn't do enough to the person that did this, but that no one has the right to take someone else's life. He supposedly went home, called Eva around 12:45 to see how she was feeling, and went to bed around 1:30. Then testimonies on his day are, again, conflicting. Sunday morning, he allegedly got a call from his cleaning lady between 8:30 and 9 a.m. And, she would testify that he, wasn't making any sense. He seemed confused. She had been regularly cleaning his house, and he seemed to not know who she was or comprehend why she was calling. She had called to confirm that, if he wanted his apartment cleaned that day. According to his roommate, George Senator, he was pacing the apartment after this and muttering to himself. And he didn't know what he was muttering to himself about, but he'd been pacing back and forth and muttering. Then he received a phone call from one of his dancers asking for some money, and he said, he'd sent it via Western Union. He left his apartment around 11 a.m., supposedly with his Dachshund, Sheba, and a portable radio. He usually kept a revolver in a bank sack in his trunk, a bank money bag, and he put this in his coat pocket. He supposedly passed the police and courts building and assumed that Oswald had already been transferred, then parked his car directly across the street from the Western Union office. He allegedly placed his keys and billfold, $1,000 in cash in the trunk, locked it, placed his trunk key in the glove compartment, and left the car unlocked. He walked to the Western Union office with his revolver, more than $2,000 in cash, and no personal ID. He filled out forms for sending $25 by telegraph to Carlin. His transaction was completed at 11:17 a.m., and according to the clerk, he turned immediately, walked out onto Main Street, and proceeded in the direction of the police department, which was 1 block away. Ruby entered the police basement through the auto ramp from Main Street and stood behind the front row of newsmen and police officers who were crowded together at the base of the ramp, awaiting the transfer of Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald emerged from a basement office around 11:21 a.m., and Ruby moved quickly forward without speaking and fired one fatal shot into his torso. Then he was quickly subdued by a rush of officers. By the way, there is video of this online. You can find it. It's pretty interesting. There's also pictures of that moment. Some of them are touched up so they look cartoony. But this dude just was able to make it into the police basement armed, walk up to this guy, and shot him right in front of all these witnesses. So there's no getting away with this, which, begs a few questions. Oh, and the official report then goes on to assert that Crawford's... What are you doing? That Crawford's decision to leave wasn't solely... it did involve, the fact that he was upset about, verbal abuse from Ruby, but he also missed his family and was planning to move on anyway. And that his decision to leave didn't indicate any involvement in any conspiracy. And so he was only receiving room and board and incidental expenses. And so on November 17th, he had told Ruby, I'm done, I'm leaving. And Ruby said, well, wait, I'll give you a salary. And so he agreed to stay. When he was found by the FBI 6 days after JFK was shot, he allegedly told them he left because he was sick of the verbal abuse and was fed up after the phone call about the dog food. And he missed his family in Michigan. This guy was only 22, and according to his testimony, he had already traveled the country, hitchhiking with his then wife and baby. 2 babies, 2 infant children. And the report then goes on to say that Ruby's calls to Ralph Paul and Breck Wall Saturday night were totally innocent, and there was no evidence of conspiratorial implications. They dismissed reports by a woman named Miss Hemlick that she had previously heard Ralph Paul exclaim while on the phone with Ruby something about a gun and, "What? Are you crazy?" So this chapter of the report, the Warren Commission report that is, ends with the paragraph. The commission has conducted an investigation of the call Ruby received from Karen Carlin at 10:19 a.m. Sunday to determine whether that call was prearranged for the purpose of a secret communique, such as conveying information about the transfer of Oswald, or provide Ruby an excuse for being in the vicinity of the police department during that transfer. The commission examined the long-distance calls, the records of long-distance calls, Sunday morning for Ruby, the Carlins, the Dallas police, and several other persons, and found no sign of any indirect communication to Ruby through the Carlins. No other evidence showing any link between Carlins and the shooting was developed. Okay. I'm not saying they were involved. I'm just saying I don't trust the commission at this point. We already know. I've kind of given away a few things already that some of their findings were bogus. A lot of their findings were bogus. Gee, I wonder why we don't trust the government. So, this report, this Warren Commission report, it does a pretty good job of making Ruby look like this passionate, this passionate guy who kind of acts like he's on drugs. And then they wrap it up saying, you know, that he actually was on drugs, legal drugs, because he actually, when asked by the commission why he shot Oswald, he told them that he had read in the newspaper that Mrs. Kennedy was going to probably have to come back for trial, and he couldn't stand the thought of her having to go through that, and so he killed Ruby. I'm sorry, he killed Oswald. So here's the specific quote from the report. He blamed his sudden need to show his love for his Jewish faith, a phrase that he claimed he never otherwise used, by paying this debt to the beloved president, saving her the ordeal of coming back on preluding. He said he thought it was a stimulus, which suddenly gave him this emotional feeling. So he said he was on this Preludin as a diet medication. And when I did just a quick search on what Preludin is, it came up as basically meth. So it came up as phenmetrazine, a substituted amphetamine. So basically meth, but the chemical makeup is a little bit, the chemical structure is a little different. But as far as I could tell, it would have the same effects. So, as I said, later investigations would find that the Warren Commission largely ignored evidence that didn't confirm their preconceived notions or what they wanted to be published as the truth. But this report, it does have direct testimony. I'd like to believe that that does give it some credence, at least as far as to the depiction of Ruby's life and his ongoings in these few days. But in the least, it's a very interesting story, even if everything turned out to be wrong. I mean, and let's go out on a limb here and postulate that maybe some of the statements that were given and the testimony maybe were influenced by, I don't know, the FBI or the Warren Commission, because both worked kind of hand in hand during that investigation. You know, maybe some of those statements were false, because if the government comes a knocking and they're like, this is what we need you to say, and you know that the president has just been assassinated, and it seems like they might be covering that up, and that's the president. Are you going to say anything otherwise? By the way, I'm not suicidal, and I'm not saying that the FBI was involved. I'm just saying, wouldn't it be interesting if, and wouldn't it be possible that maybe some of the statements weren't entirely correct? I'm not saying that they're wrong. Just what if? But, you know, security cameras, photographs, and phone records do confirm a lot of these timestamps for Jack Ruby. And the locations. So I'm inclined to believe this is a fairly accurate reconstruction of his days. What I'm not convinced of, at least not completely, as of right now, is his reasoning for killing Lee Harvey Oswald. So he supposedly didn't know who Chief Justice Earl Warren was, because he had allegedly asked on one of the phone calls. And so after all this, I started asking myself some questions. Who is Lawrence Myers, and what businesses does he own? So he's a Chicago guy, and he's an alleged, well, we'll get there. Who are Ralph Paul and Breck Wall? What were his ties to the Assistant District Attorney William Alexander? Who were his attorney and accountant? So his attorney was Stanley Kaufman. The accountant, I never did find any info on that. Ties to the jeweler Frank Bellocchio. Ties to Clyde Gadash, or other than dropping off his usual ads. Ties to Officer Harry Olson, or was it just the relationship with his dancer? And, why did this guy suddenly quit the force, etc.? This Andrew Armstrong fella, his assistant at the Carousel Club, you know, who was he? And did any of them or Ruby have any ties or connections with maybe Mafia? Or, let's say, for example, Carlos Marcello, or any connections with Clay Shaw. So I looked into these questions, and we're going to get into it in part 4. If you enjoyed this, and if you want to hear more, please like and subscribe, follow me, and check out the next video, where I will address these things, and I will answer some of these questions. It gets interesting, and we'll get there. We'll get to the point where I explain to you why I'm convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt it was conspiracy. And I have a theory who was behind it. and we'll get there. Have a wonderful day.